Very much welcome to Finanspanelen, the finance panel this dark December morning. My name is Per Véron and I will guide you through this morning. And we will talk about the European banking union. And the reason is that a week ago a public inquiry into whether Sweden should join the banking union or not, or the arguments for and against, was published. And we will use that as a starting point this morning. And for that reason, we have Anna-Karin Jatko, the inquiry chair. I'm glad you put that up, because I don't know the titles in English for ordförande, huvudsekreterare. And Fredrik Bystedt, the principal secretary of this inquiry, here to present it for us. And they will use 20 minutes to make this introduction. And then we have three commentators, Nicolas, Véron, a frequent visitor to Sweden and to Finanspanelen, and we're very happy to see you here. He is one of the founding fathers of Bruegel and a research fellow at Peterson Institute, and frequently asked in Financial Times and other places on things that happen in the banking sector, being an authority on European banking. And then we have Lars Calmfors, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at the Stockholms University. And I think so well known that I don't need to introduce him more than that. And Hans Lindberg, the CEO of the Swedish Bankers Association. And we have given them strict time limits so that we will have, when they are through with their introductions, 25 minutes for questions and statements, whatever. And please take the opportunity. I mean, this is partly complicated things with the banking union, so take the opportunity to learn the things you don't understand. And once again, very much welcome, and above all, Anna-Karin Jatko, welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased that there's so many of you that are actually keen enough to come and talk about the banking union and grey morning in December. So, as those of you who are not familiar in how a committee works, I'm going to go through some of the remit, the mandate, and Fredrik, who's actually done most of the work along with the secretariat, is going to go through some of the salient conclusions, and I will then finalize the presentation. So first, the financial sector, not least the banks, is obviously very important. A well-functioning and stable banking sector is of benefit to all, not least the Swedish economy. Adequate supervision and effective crisis management are both crucial to a well-functioning banking sector. So fundamentally, the decision to join the banking union or to remain outside the banking union is a question of how to best ensure competitiveness in the Swedish financial sector, the banking sector, and financial stability. Potential participation is a multifaceted question. We haven't exactly made it easy for us, so we've looked at a number of aspects. Not only economic, most of them are obviously economic, and I know most of you probably have that specific interest, but there are also a number of predominantly political issues that the committee has looked at, not least the question of future influence of Sweden in the EU, especially concerning economic and political cooperation. The decision as to potential participation in the banking union requires a bit of a balancing act. It's a balancing of several consequences of participation, and the remit. The remit was to produce a comprehensive analysis of potential participation. It's a comparison between conditions in the banking union and in Sweden. It's really based on this comparison. We have tried to identify consequences, both in terms of staying outside or joining the banking union. Effectively, it is a civil servant's wet dream, pros, cons, risks. And I think what has been very interesting is that it is a little bit complicated in terms of the fact that Sweden is obviously a non-euro member state. The question has not been to look into potentially joining the euro. It has been to potentially join the banking union. And as you may well know, I think most of you well know, it is really a question of when you're not a euro member country, participation has to be looked at being on equivalent terms, not on equal terms. And I'll say a few words on that a bit later, and so will Fredrik probably. It is not an evaluation of the effectiveness of supervision or crisis management in the banking union, nor is it an evaluation of effectiveness of Swedish authorities that are involved in supervision or crisis management. So that may be worth bearing in mind. The task has really been to assess the preconditions for participation, and I have hoped, and I know that the Secretariat has worked very hard to produce a thorough basis for making a considered political decision. And as a civil servant, it is obviously something you wish that all decisions are made based on a considered fact. It is, and I will disappoint you, I'm sure you will know that already, it is not an ability or a possibility to answer the question, should Sweden join the banking union, which I know is the question today, but as there are a number of you commenting on that specific question, I shall leave that to you, but it was not the task of the committee. Nor was it really to fully answer all the questions when it comes to uncertainty. We finalized the report when we believed uncertainty has possibly increased, and we have uncertainty as to the outcome of Brexit. Well, we know the outcome of Brexit, but we don't know the effects on Sweden of the outcome of Brexit. Economic downturn, somewhat difficult times in terms of trade war, or trade wars, potentially, and last but not least, the banking union has not been finalized either, it's still being developed. So there are some uncertainties that have made it a little bit more difficult than we had initially thought. This is a very broad remit, I won't go through all of them, I'll just say that there are a number of economic, political and legal points that we have tried to assess. Most of them are on the slide. The report is rather extensive and technical. I'm not necessarily expecting everybody to read all of it. I recommend the summary, and we won't be going through all of it here today either, because then we'll be here till Christmas, and I'm sure you've got other things to do. And I'm very proud to conclude that I've had the privilege of working with a very competent secretariat that has both extensive knowledge of economic and law, but also extensive first-hand experience of policy making both in Sweden as well as in the EU. In addition, the committee has been supported by a number of distinguished experts. I see some of you here today from many fields, and we have obviously had the expertise, knowledge of a number of authorities, academia, law, civil servants, as well as the banking industry itself. And to all of those that have contributed, I am really very grateful, but it is, after all, at the end of the day, my sole responsibility. So if you don't agree with all the conclusions, that's absolutely fine. We have had a lot of contact, not least the Secretariat, with a number of member countries, and also, of course, with all the relevant EU institutions. And they have all been very helpful in providing data, technical knowledge, and some insight into how the exact workings of the banking unions are playing out at the moment. We have also commissioned 3 academic reports, Professor Beck, Professor Rittling, and last but not least, Professor Véron. So for those of you that want to really spend the Christmas reading about the banking union, this is a way to go. And all of them have, well, they are all more or less published. I know that Per's report will be published shortly. today. There you go. So you don't need to wait any longer. Just a few brief words as to what exactly is the banking union and what is our definition of the banking union. And in its present form, it is effectively a mechanism for common bank supervision as well as common crisis management through resolution of banks. It is solely based on the single rule book, where all member countries, irrespective of whether they are members of the banking union or not, need to adhere and stick to the rules. So we have defined this as being a uniform application of the single rule book. The rationale behind the banking union is effectively to ensure financial stability and safeguard and develop the internal market. The banking union does not contain any new rules nor any new responsibilities. It is effectively the single rule book, and it was established against the backdrop of the euro crisis in 2010 to 2012, but it is also a rationale to preserve and deepen the internal market for financial services. And the latter, the internal market for financial services, is the main reason for which non-member states actually have a possibility to join the banking union, although they are not member of the Eurozone. It's effectively a division of labour between the ECB and the SRB when it comes to supervision and resolution, and they are primarily focused on so-called significant banks or systemically important banks. Apart from the SRB and the ECB, the national authorities also play a very important role in the banking union. At the moment, as you are all aware, all the EU Euro countries have mandatory participation in the banking union. Bulgaria, as well as Croatia, have applied to join the banking union as part of their path to becoming a member of the euro. And Denmark is currently, very shortly, maybe even this week, presenting their conclusions after having had a second committee on whether they should join the banking union or not. There is one part of the banking unions that is still being looked at, and that is a political discussion very much ongoing about a common deposit guarantee scheme. So that's something that we haven't really looked into in detail. And at this point, Fredrik, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. As Anna-Karin said, our task has not been to provide draft legislation or give any recommendation. And to disappoint you further, we don't have a top 10 list of the pros and cons and risk in the report. And the reason why is that we as Anna-Karin also emphasized, the report or the remit is very broad. It includes a number of aspects, economic, legal, and political. So obviously some of the pros and cons and risks are more important than others. And if you read the report, which I encourage you to do, you will find that some of these we emphasize some of the pros and cons of potential participation. So what I will give to you here today is some what we call salient conclusions, and by salient conclusions I mean some of the facts or perspectives that we deem to be more important to consider going forward when this is taken when this is being considered at the political level. First of all, it's in our remit that we should assess whether there are any constitutional impediments to potential participation. And that's obviously a good start to see, is this constitutionally possible or not, or do you need to change the constitution? And why is that? Well, more precisely, would participation confer new powers to the EU level? And just to give you the very short answer is that our assessment is that Sweden has already conferred the powers to legislate and to make decisions on supervision and crisis management to the EU level. And that is because Sweden has, over time, we have ratified a number of EU treaties that include these powers. So therefore, there is no need to change the constitution, and by constitution I mean the instrument of government, regeringsformen, and the accession act, the anslutningsavtalet. So there is a good reason, we think, to believe that there are no further steps that need to be taken around the constitution. However, we do think that if Sweden were to join, there will be a need for some kind of framework, new framework legislations around how the sort of match the regulation that defines the banking union with Swedish legislation. As Anna-Karin said, we emphasize that the single rule book applies to all member states, irrespective of their status vis-à-vis the banking union, and the single rule book for banks applies to all member states. And this single rule book are becoming more harmonized, and our assessment is this process will continue going forward. And most recently, there has been the so-called banking package that has been decided at the EU level, and that will be implemented next year into Swedish law. And I think the committee that have been tasked with implementing the banking package into Swedish law presented their report last week. It's not only the single rule book in terms of the different requirements on banks, for instance, capital requirements, that is being harmonized, but it's also the kind of supervisory practice. So there are a lot of detailed guidelines and recommendations from for instance, the European Banking Agency that sort of limits the room for maneuver for national authorities. So that means, according to our view, that there will be less flexibility even if Sweden decides not to participate in the banking union. So, but it's also our assessment that if Sweden decides to stay outside the banking union, there will be some room for maneuver for the national authorities, meaning the Finansinspektionen and Riksgälden, to apply requirements on banks that are based on specific Swedish risks. And more precisely, that flexibility would first of all apply to the macroprudential buffers. So macroprudential buffers or macroprudential tools are, even if you join the banking union, they are national competence. And macroprudential buffers, they are buffers that are harmonized within the EU legislation. So, of course, even if you join the bank or participate in the banking union, at the national level, you would be you would have the possibility of applying those macroprudential buffers. But it also pertains to Pillar 2 requirements, that means bank-specific requirements. What we have not been able to take into account the specific rules that will come out of the implementation of the banking package into to Swedish law. But in sum, it's our assessment that the room for maneuver, if Sweden stays outside, will be more and more limited, but there will be some room for maneuver if we stay outside. As I said, when it comes to macroprudential tools, even if Sweden participates in the banking union, those powers will be sort of kept at the national level. And that goes for a number of other areas as well, most notably the responsibility for supervision and resolution planning for what is called a less significant institution, meaning roughly smaller banks. Now the ECB and the SRB, the Single Resolution Board, they will be directly responsible for supervision and resolution of larger banks. But the responsibility for these smaller banks will be sort of kept at the national level. And the responsibility for other kinds of financial supervision and for anti-money laundering will also be kept at the national level. So there's a large chunk of supervision and resolution that will stay at the national level. And it will also be the case that the national authorities are deeply involved in the supervision also of larger banks. Now, having said that, the ECB and the SRB, they're responsible for the design of supervision and resolution also for the larger banks. So it's not that you can do whatever you want, because, and especially over time, we believe that the ECB and SRB will also apply similar supervisory policies to smaller banks. So when the banking union was negotiated in 2012, there was a broad consensus that non-euro area member states should be able to participate on equal terms. But since supervisory powers were conferred on the ECB, the treaty made it impossible to provide participation on equal terms. And the fact that the governing council of the ECB is the highest decision-making body in the ECB makes participation on equal terms impossible because the governor of the Riksbank is not part of the ECB. To make a very complicated issue short, there's a number of special safeguard mechanisms that were created to compensate for non-euro area member states for the lack of equal terms. And one such safeguard mechanism is that non-euro area member states can ultimately leave the banking union. And that means that this safeguard and other offsetting factors, we believe that there are preconditions for participation on equivalent terms, but that it's a political decision or assessment whether those terms are sufficiently equivalent. Now, briefly on some of the other conclusions we make. We believe that the effects on banks, Swedish banks, are limited, especially in the longer term. And there are also in the longer term, there are better competitive conditions if Sweden joins the banking union, and that has to do with the uniform application of rules within the banking union, and we believe that that would be a benefit also to Swedish banks. And because the effects on banks are limited, we also believe that the effects on the credit supply to households and firms will be limited, because we don't foresee any major cost decrease in cost or increase in cost if Sweden participates, and therefore the effects on credit supply will be limited. We also assessed, and this is very difficult and a bit speculative, but we also think that there will be limited consequences for Stockholm as a financial center. Another limited consequence is that we also believe that or assess that the effects on public finances will be limited. And finally, and perhaps interesting, is that I mean, there is no concrete proposal for us to, or have not been a concrete proposal for us to assess when it comes to a common deposit guarantee. However, we have some discussion in principle whether a common deposit guarantee would be beneficial to the banking union and to Sweden if Sweden was to participate. And our conclusion is that a common deposit guarantee is probably a good idea for the banking union as a whole, meaning that you will have supervision and crisis management and deposit guarantee at the same level. But for Swedish banks and for the Swedish decision, it will be of lesser importance, and that is because of two factors. The first is that most of the larger Swedish banks, they are financed not through deposits, but rather some other forms of market finance. And the second is that since the larger bank will typically be handled, if they fail, they will typically be handled in resolution and not liquidated. And that means that banks will not be closed down, and depositors will have access to the deposits. So a deposit guarantee for the larger banks is probably not of such large relevance in the Swedish case. Thank you.
Right. Briefly, the key considerations. This is a balancing act when you make a political decision. So there are a number of somewhat uncertain economic and political consequences. And what we've done, or rather what I have done, is that I've emphasized a few key considerations, which I think are particularly important when the decision is going to be made as to whether to participate or not. And the first one is really a bit of a philosophical question in terms of the fact that what is the best course of action for Sweden when it comes to the fact that the Swedish economy is very dependent on the internal market. It is also very dependent on a well-functioning banking sector, not least in view of the fact that we are a very export-orientated economy. So what will really serve us best in terms of ensuring financial markets? And this is something for the Swedish economy, and this is something that's, I think our politicians need to have a long-term view of what will serve us best in the long term. Secondly, some of the key considerations is that my view is that in terms of financial stability, which is really the key point of this whole exercise, we believe that in normal times it really has limited consequences. However, what happens in a systemic crisis, if there are a large number of banks that are all somehow hit by a crisis, well, nobody really knows, to be quite honest. It's somewhat uncertain, and there could be a difficult trade-off between Swedish interests and EU interests, but there could also be no trade-off, because in a lot of ways, a well-functioning internal market for financial services is essential for both parties. Last but not least, we have also discussed the fact that it's important to bear in mind what will really gain Sweden most influence long-term, and what is the risk of marginalization long-term when it comes to participation or not. And I think there could be different answers to that, depending on your starting point. And I believe that some of the other panelists have got other starting points potentially. So I'm very happy to leave those questions to some of my colleagues here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and first thanks to Per and the SNS and the organizers of this for having me in Stockholm again. It is a great honor, and of course, I have two employers, Bruegel and the Peterson Institute. Both have many Swedish links. Suffice to say that both the Swedish government and the Riksbank are members of Bruegel, and that the founding god of the Peterson Institute is called Fred Bergsten. The report is comprehensive, very honest. I think it is very honest, as you both emphasized, to say that in terms of Swedish role, both as a financial center and in terms of financial stability, we simply don't know. So it's a matter of opinion whether participation in the banking union will boost Stockholm as a financial center. I would say yes, but this is judgmental. It is also a matter of judgment whether participation in the banking union would increase or decrease the risks for financial stability. And I think this simply depends on crisis scenarios. So by definition, we cannot know, and you highlighted that at the end. I think on balance, it's a risk-reducing or risk-mitigating move, but of course, there are scenarios where it's better to be outside. I will try to offer a complementary perspective to the report on the current debate on reform of the banking union, because I think it's very important to see the banking union as an object that is dynamic, not static. It's, after all, a very young policy. Its starting point was in mid-2012, and it is also very complex. It has many dimensions. The rationale for banking union, as you again rightly said, is hybrid. It's financial stability and it's the internal market. The trigger for the decision to initiate the banking union in mid-2012 was unquestionably financial stability in the specific context of the Eurozone, where it took the form of tackling the notorious vicious circle between banks and sovereigns, which I will come back to. Obviously, Sweden not being in the Eurozone, and as long as it has a separate monetary policy and currency regime, as it is currently the case, this issue of the vicious circle between banks and sovereign does not apply to Sweden, even if it were to join the banking union. So the reasons that compelled the Eurozone member states to create the banking union does not exist for Sweden in the foreseeable future. However, the single market is also very important, and I think it has to be viewed as one of the twin objectives of banking union, and that's obviously very relevant for Sweden. However, the bank-sovereign vicious circle in the monetary union is central to the discussion on banking union in the Eurozone. It is central to the current reform discussion. And that's what I will focus on now. I will not explain all the content of my slides. I have too many slides, so I will go very quickly through them, being mindful of time. It's actually very complicated. I will give you a highly summarized snapshot, but I hope that is helpful for the Swedish discussion. So currently we have a halfway banking union. If you look at it from the perspective of its founding intent, breaks the vicious circle between banks and sovereign. I assume you're all familiar with the language of the leaders when they introduced the banking union. That's exactly what they said. It is imperative to break this vicious circle. We have what, in my view, and in most observers' view, is a strong and credible ECB supervision, also known as the single supervisory mechanism. I would say that Swedish supervision is certainly pretty good. I'll leave anti-money laundering aside for a moment, but it's not unambiguously superior to SSM supervision. You can discuss which one is better on which particular aspect of supervision, and I'm not going to challenge the widely held view in this place, in this city, that Swedish supervision is better. I'm just saying it's not unambiguous. The resolution framework, however, is very messy, and I think it is fair to say that it doesn't work as intended. The SRB has a reasonably strong legal basis, but it has not yet acquired the kind of credibility you would want. There are many, and it's not really their fault, even so we can discuss if they made mistakes, but the main reason for that is a number of loopholes in the legislation and in the incentives of the different players, including also national authorities, particularly resolution authorities, and also DG competition in the European Commission, which, as you know, plays a very important role in resolution cases. And the result has been a near systematic circumvention of the resolution framework as enshrined in BRRD in the Eurozone. Interestingly, BRRD is much better complied with outside of the Eurozone, particularly in Denmark, which had a few cases, than in the Eurozone. And the bail-in principle in the Eurozone is mostly honored in the breach. As you know, there is no deposit insurance. Cross-border integration, if you look at it directionally, there is some cross-border integration in the Eurozone, but it hasn't made any meaningful progress since the banking union was introduced, and the vicious circle remains almost intact. So now I will go very quickly through the next slides, if I can have them. Yeah, the chronology is familiar. This is just to say that it started in 2012, and there have been several milestones in the meantime. Frederick mentioned the banking package, a series of legislation in 2017 and 2019, but they're not about banking union. The proposal of the European Commission on EDIS is stuck, so all the legislation dates back to 2013, 2014, and the current debate with the new Commission is about how to update that. Now, there is a need for action, and the kind of halfway banking union that I presented, and it is presented at much more length and in much more detail in the report, is not a stable situation. First, Eurozone countries get the pain of the reform without the gain, in a way. They have the discipline of European banking supervision, and the political difficulty of managing European supervision on national banks, but without really the promise, which is the stability and market integration benefits that come with a complete banking union. There is still a lot of ring fencing of capital and liquidity. There's still a lot of fragility from the near intact bank sovereign vicious circle. And there is also risk of moving backwards. Besides the fact that a number of benefits in terms of reduction of redenomination risk, economic, better growth outcomes through a restructuring of the banking sector and other single market benefits are not reaped with the current halfway house. I think the risk of moving backwards is important to keep in mind, and when I presented the banking union as something dynamic, not static, that's part of the equation. There was a somewhat poignant speech by Danielle Nouy, which I think was her last before leaving her position as the first chair of the supervisory board, so of the SSM, at the ECB last year. And you can read the quote. She was very concerned that absent further reform, there could be an unraveling of the banking union as we have it now. And I think she's right. I wouldn't over-dramatize this. I don't think this risk is very elevated now, but that adds to the imperative of finishing the job before the next crisis hits, because that would add a lot of the resilience and solidity of what has been built. So the good news is there is a bit of a change of mood in the Eurozone on this. There was a silver lining of the Italian scare of May-June 2018 was that people were reminded that the doom loop or bank sovereign vicious circle is still there. It is clear that the fact that resolution doesn't work is not limited to Italy, by the way. We have the case of NordLB, not very far from here, very much in the news. And also people are increasingly aware that a number of lingering government protections which are connected with the unfinished nature of the banking union are prevented what is needed for not just the health of the banking sector, but the health of the Eurozone economy, which is more restructuring of the banking sector, more consolidation, probably more industrial kind of restructuring so that the banks return to profitability and good credit allocation. Also, maybe that's a bit more mercantilist, but as you know, a lot of people in the Eurozone are concerned with the international role of the euro and having basically European banks that have big positions in the European market, so not getting their lunch eaten by the Americans, especially in wholesale markets. And that is also something that is helpful in terms of reform. And of course, there's a new commission. So there is, it's not just, the op-ed in the Financial Times by Olaf Scholz a few weeks ago. There's a much broader change of atmospherics in Brussels and in the Eurozone that is supportive of a reform package. It has to be a package because all the different issues are interconnected. Those of you who are familiar with those issues will be familiar with the reasoning here. For those who are not familiar, I won't have time to explain all the interconnections, and I apologize for that. But the point is, there was a hope that you could have a sequential approach and different milestones and different steps in completing the banking union. I think people have recently come to the realization, especially in the Eurogroup last week or 2 weeks ago, that last week, that 2 weeks ago, that if you don't tackle all these issues together, deposit insurance, sovereign exposures, making resolution work, you cannot tackle them at all because they're all part of the same bundle of problems. And I think that's progress also, that people now accept these interlinkages because that's the only way to go forward. Now, this package of reforms, which would include something like sovereign concentration charges, making resolution work, creating a European deposit insurance, and of course removing all the ring-fencing authorities that, and mandates that exist at the national level. This is a big package. It's very complicated, but it's not as big and complicated as what was achieved between 2012 and 2014. So it is ambitious, but achievable. It doesn't have to include all items in the discussion. Again, without time for elaborating, I would say it doesn't necessarily have to include all crisis management instruments because, there are things that you can only decide under duress, I guess. It doesn't have to include safe assets. That's a big discussion in parts of the Eurozone. It doesn't have to include full bank insolvency law harmonization. It doesn't have to include taxation issues. All these items are in the discussion, but ultimately I think will not be in the package, and that's fine because they are not absolutely needed. So basically the package that would be needed to complete the banking union doesn't require treaty change. Here I echo Frederick on the Swedish constitution. It's easier when you don't have to change those things. It doesn't require further fiscal union. The ESM as it exists in the Eurozone would be apt as backstop. The political economy is complicated, but for all member states there are elements of balance, and ultimately it can be a good deal for everybody. So it's an ambitious agenda, but progress is achievable. There is no reason to be cynical about the point of the discussion right now. For Sweden, I will echo the conclusions of the report. There is no imperative to join. There is no major obstacle against joining. So basically, there is a choice to be made, which is a luxury after all. The banking union has not reached final form, so if you join now, you join the reform conversation, and I, for one, I'm absolutely persuaded that the Swedish voice would count in that debate and could tilt it in a direction which is not only better for Sweden but also better for Europe. Now, of course, if you join later, if there is a package that has been decided, you know what you join with more clarity than if you join now. No question about that. But again, the package will depend on the debate, and Sweden can influence the debate if it's in the conversation. And of course, there are broader issues of relationship with Europe and the EU. I think it's obvious to everybody here, so I don't have to elaborate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thanks then for the invitation to comment. First, a few general remarks. I find the report well written. I find it well argued. It goes through almost every possible aspect of whether or not Sweden should join the banking union. But I also note that the report has induced very little of public discussion. That lack of interest is not so surprising. I guess to most people the issue is quite technical. It's not exactly the question that will stir the masses. And it's easy in normal times to forget its importance. But I think the lack of attention may also be related to how the report is written. It's extremely nuanced. For every argument in favor of joining the banking union, there is almost a strong argument for not joining, and vice versa. There is no weighing of various arguments to reach a clear overall conclusion. Admittedly, this is in line with the remit to analyze pros and cons of joining. But I think it would have been very helpful with more definite conclusions to get a clearer benchmark for the subsequent discussion. So, therefore, I shall offer my help in coming to conclusions, and I'll focus then on the aspects that I find the most important. Externalities, insurance, technical efficiency of supervision and crisis management, and political ramifications. First then, externalities. For both supervision and resolution of banks, decisions at the national level may imply externalities, effects on other countries that may not be taken into account. So the result is likely to be too weak incentives to avoid financial risks and insufficient efforts to save banks in crisis situations. And this is an argument for moving supervision and resolution to a supranational level. This argument is of course stronger the more cross-border activities that banks have. And then Swedish banks' dependence on wholesale funding from international capital markets, the links to Finland and the Baltic states gives this externality argument for joining quite some force. And of course this argument becomes stronger if Denmark were to join. But the joint benefits from supervision and resolution at the European level does not necessarily mean that every country gains. This depends on how the gains are shared. There has been this worry that as the ECB's governing council has the final say on supervisory decisions, too little attention might be paid to non-Eurozone members who will not be represented there. But the possibilities to leave, as we heard, the banking union in this case should work as a safeguard. To sum up, I think the externality argument speaks in favor of Sweden joining the banking union. Then we have the insurance argument. A banking union with pooled resources for handling a crisis, that represents a better insurance. Participation would benefit us if we get problems. And we might have serious difficulties in Sweden of handling a bank crisis if it were to arise. To do that on our own, because we have, as you know, such a large banking sector. But on the other hand, risks today are much larger in some other EU countries, where banks have higher ratios of non-performing loans, as an example, which implies risk that we might have to pay for bank failures elsewhere. And of course, the greatest potential problem is Italy. Italian banks have a considerably larger share of non-performing loans than Swedish. But I think the greatest risk is the high government debt and the large exposure of Italian banks to it, which still in some situations could initiate a new doom loop, as Nicolas discussed. So I take it that the insurance argument speaks against Swedish membership in the banking union. Then we have considerations about the technical efficiency of supervision and resolution. And I think these considerations cut both ways. On one hand, EU institutions can build up more expertise than national institutions because they will have more cases to handle. And the risk of regulatory capture is smaller. On the other hand, there is a risk of too uniform an approach, and that there will be insufficient knowledge of the specific Swedish conditions. A final consideration concerns political influence in the EU. I think that joining the banking union might somewhat increase our say in the EU. But any such effect is highly uncertain. It's probably very small, at least compared to joining the monetary union. So I would not put much weight on this. To sum up, my take on the issue is this. Externality arguments speak in favor, insurance arguments in net against. There is a draw when coming to the technical efficiency arguments. Political influence arguments are unimportant. So what about the overall conclusion? Well, in some long-run equilibrium, where hopefully most of the current problems with non-performing loans in some countries have been dealt with, we could probably be in just as well as out. No need for more inquiries, we could just toss a coin. But the long-run equilibrium is not so interesting for the decision now on whether or not to join. And here I believe the conclusion is much clearer. The current legacy problems means a serious risk that membership now implies that we might end up paying for the problems of others from the past. I believe there is a clear option value of waiting to see that the legacy problems are sorted out and what happens with the ideas on a common deposit insurance scheme. So, the recommendation that I think should have been given in the report is do not join the banking union now, but be open to it later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me start by complimenting Anna-Karin Jatko and Fredrik Bystedt for an excellent inquiry. And perhaps I should also state from the start that Bankföreningen, the Swedish Bankers Association, doesn't have a position about the banking union. Having said that, I would like to say a few words about the Swedish framework for financial stability and the status in the Swedish banking system, and the most important pros and cons for the banks if entering the banking union. First of all, I think we have done a very good job when it's come to financial stability in Sweden since the financial crisis. We have a very strong framework. If you look at this figure, you can see that we have a resolution fund that is 3 times higher than the case is in the banking union. We have a deposit insurance guarantee system, which have a double level than the case is in the banking union, and the banks are well capitalized. If Sweden would join the banking union, I think around 6 banks would be considered significant. And here you see the 3 most significant banks compared with the peers within the banking union. And as you can see, the Swedish banks are well capitalized. They are extremely cost efficient. They have a healthy profitability with dividend yields above average. And if you look how the market rate them, you see that the Swedish bank have quite a high credibility with low CDS spreads. Overall, I think the Swedish banks are in a low-risk economy. They have a low-risk balance sheet, and they have low credit losses. And this diagram shows the non-performing loans, first back to the year of 2000, in the middle of the financial crisis, and then the status today. And Sweden actually has the lowest ratio within the European Union when it comes to non-performing loans. And the level was quite low even during the financial crisis. And top countries in this league is, for instance, Italy and Greece and so on. They are not included in this diagram. But as you can see, even Germany has a much higher level than Sweden. Finally, it's important to note that Sweden has quite strong public finances compared with other EU countries, and they are still going down the debt level, so to say. And in the diagram to the right, you can see the effect of the financial crisis. Sweden were hit quite severely the last quarter of 2008, but after a year or so, the employment level reached the original level, and employment have evolved quite quickly up. And the conclusion from that diagram is that I think that the Swedish political system was able to handle the financial crisis quite well compared with other countries. So we have a robust banking system in Sweden, public finances are okay, and the framework is for financial stability is well developed. What are the major pros and cons for the Swedish banks then? Well, most of them at this list is included, or all of them are included. Everything are included in the inquiry. But here you can see perhaps the most important ones for the banks. And the bottom line then, the conclusion, I believe, is when it comes to the Swedish banks, they are robust and would function well inside or outside the banking union. So that's my non-conclusive conclusion. Thank you so much.
So, lots of pros and cons. We have a bit over 15 minutes for comments, questions, whatever from the audience. If you raise your hand and wait for a microphone, because this is being filmed, and I see Carl Hamilton's hand in the air. Microphone is coming. There you are.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting presentations, and especially, of course, from our foreign guest. I was a bit surprised by the last presentation that everything is fine with Swedish banks, because most people in Sweden are very worried about the money laundering problems which exists in our banks, mainly imported from the Baltic states. And Lars Calmfors, you said that, well, this thing about technical efficiency and so on is cut both ways. But in the report, which is certainly very neutral, it's like Sweden when it decided to join the European Union because the fear of not joining was bigger. And that's the same here. But what it says in the report is that the resources and the competence of supervision, among other things, in terms with regard to money laundering, would be bigger if we joined, if we were incorporated in the banking union. So, given the state of affairs with our money laundering problem and this advantage of being a member of the banking union, does that not change anything? Perhaps you could say that the decision is like you take a vaccination. It's a problem perhaps the first few hours or days, but it's better in the long run. The same thing here. It's better to look at the long run. Okay.
Sounds like a question and a statement at the same time. Nicolas wants to...
Yeah, I would like to echo this. I think there is... Obviously, the flip side of having things going well is that there is a risk of complacency. And I think what happened in money laundering in Sweden is a good antidote to that, because it should remind everybody that, you know, nothing is forever. And yes, Sweden is comparing very well in a number of dimensions when it comes to prudential supervision. But that shouldn't lead to a sense that, you know, there is intrinsic superiority or intrinsic insulation from a number of risks. And the stuff about money laundering is a good reminder of that. So maybe rather than a vaccination, I would compare it to a health insurance. I say, and this is where I would maybe question Lars's argument about insurance. I think he overestimates the legacy issues and the way Sweden would have to pay for them. But that's a bit of a long discussion, so we probably won't have time for it. What I would say is, when is the best time to take a health insurance? Is that when you're very healthy, or is that when you're starting to look a bit weak? And obviously the answer to that is, better take a health insurance when you're healthy. So that would be my metaphor. Now, on AML, I would also say that this is a fast-moving conversation at the EU level. It's a single market issue, so Sweden is part of it. But I think we will have more centralized supervision of financial institutions for AML purposes pretty soon, actually.
Okay, Lars?
I mean, it's of course very hard to judge the legacy problems, but I guess my gut feeling would be that you could never overestimate the problems that could arise in Italy. That, I think, is a rather reasonable starting point. That the potential problems that are there in Italy because of the high debt and the amount of government debt held by Italian banks, I think that is something really to worry about.
Okay. Hans, no? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. A short comment about AML. First, I note that the debate so far about AML concerns events that are 10 years old or something like that. But anyhow, if Sweden would join the banking union, Finansinspektionen would be responsible for supervising AML even then. And I think that Finansinspektionen is doing a good job now on this issue, and the banks put on a lot of effort to also do a good job. Most importantly about AML, I think we must reform the system. We must open up for information sharing, cooperation between banks, cooperation between authorities and banks. And there will be an inquiry about this now in Sweden. And we from Bankföreningen have made a couple of proposals to the government to reform the system. So we hope we will fix this in Sweden in a year or two, the system as such.
That sounds comforting. Per, and we have 10 minutes to go, so please, short questions.
Yes, I'll try my very best. Thank you so much. I think it's working. It's two dimensions to this discussion, if I may just try to summarize it. First, you have all the details and nitty-gritties on how to best organize the supervision and your resolution, which obviously are quite important. But then you also have the bigger dimension of the overall political assessment. What is Sweden's place to be in the European Union going forward? And the inquiry addresses both of these issues. I would like to ask Professor Calmfors, I mean, given your experience with similar inquiries, if I may put it that way, do you expect any of these, which of these two dimensions would you expect to dominate the discussion going forward? I mean, you've said now that the political influence argument are weaker in your assessment at the current stage, but going forward, what do you think the discussion will be dominated by?
I'm most afraid that there will not be so much discussion at all. I think that's the basic problem. And we were in a similar situation when we made the government commission on the EMU. We had a similar remit, I mean, to analyze the pros and cons. But that does not rule out, I mean, as long as it does not forbid you to give clearer conclusions, I think you should, you could do it. And I think that would have been very, very helpful for the subsequent discussion. It's very good to have a clear benchmark to start from than just a list of sort of non-weighted pros and cons. So I'm a little bit, I think you could have been more audacious there. But, I mean, admittedly, you do follow your remit, and the analysis is very good. I mean, it's a very rich source to dig into and find various arguments. Political considerations, I don't think, I mean, they should influence this decision very much. I mean, I think it will have a marginal effect on our influence in the European Union. And I think if we would, even if we join the banking union now, I think we would have only a marginal effect on how it is developing. So I think we could forget about these arguments and then focus on the other arguments, where of course one can weigh the arguments in different ways than I did. But I noticed that I seem to be one of the few who expresses sort of an opinion on this, and I think that is a bit worrying that no one else can come to a conclusion.
Okay.
But you always come to the wrong conclusion.
Lars said that we should wait and see. So let me ask you, sort of, how long should we wait and see, and what should we be waiting for? So what would be the sign that, yes, now it's time to enter the banking union?
Sorting out of the legacy problems. Then it's of course
it's the legacy problem.
Yes, it's a matter of judgment. I mean, at what point of time do you think that they have been sufficiently?
So it's not a matter of waiting for the common deposit insurance. I mean, there are a number of.
I think that is less important.
So it's the legacy problems.
Are more important. Yes.
Nicolas, you have a.
Yeah, I will defend the report. I think the report is good because it stops exactly short of the point where you have to exercise judgment to go to the next step. So basically the report gives you everything you would want in terms of pretty objective assessment. Nothing is ever entirely objective, but I think this one qualifies. And any step beyond in the direction that Lars advises would be very judgmental. And indeed, Lars's arguments are very judgmental. And I think he would agree with that proposition. Now, when he said you could never overestimate the problems in Italy, I will push back against that because you can overestimate the problems in Italy, and the market did exactly that last year when there was this scare on spread that I referred to. And it's obvious now that if you go back to late May, early June 2018, the market overestimated the problems in Italy, and it was wrong. And I think Lars does overestimate the problems in Italy still now. So that's why I'm referring to judgment. This discussion will not be able to establish whether he's right and I'm wrong, or the other way around, but there is a lot of judgment involved here. And that connects to Per's question about the right point to join. There will never be a point unless there is a crisis that forces you to join, and that could happen. But short of that, there will never be a point where you can say, okay, now all my conditions have been made, I no longer have any uncertainty. So it's a question of leadership. It reminds me, sorry to, everybody who thinks of Sweden outside of Sweden at this point thinks of Greta Thunberg, and I'm sorry about that. But when she was at the US Congress, she made that point. So a US congressman was asking her, why do you ask us to reduce our carbon emissions when China is emitting so much? And she said, well, my country is, and my continent are acting on climate change, even so we're small contributors. But that's leadership. That's what you have to do if you're serious about an objective. I would say that Sweden's voice would count in the Eurozone reform debate and banking union reform debate if it were to join the banking union. It would not be negligible. And it would not be negligible in the system more generally. It's not a huge country, but it's not a very small participant, and it can exercise leadership.
Okay, I have one more question over there, please.
Daniel Wiberg, the Swedish Federation for Business Owners. I have a question to Anna-Karin and perhaps also a bit to Hans. Usually we are very worried about increasing costs for the Swedish banks because the costs will always be transferred to the most or to the least mobile bank customers, which is the small businesses. Who are least likely to change banks and so on. So my question is, and I noticed that Fredrik mentioned that there will be limited costs increased, but also Professor Calmfors mentioned externalities and so on. So could you elaborate a little bit on this? How do you see the costs of these externalities of staying outside the banking union, and are they indeed so limited as you mentioned? And Hans, you are usually worried about this, so perhaps you have a different view.
Anna-Karin, please.
Right. Yeah, we have assessed this, and we've come to the conclusion that the direct cost for Swedish banks to join would be about 240 million krona per year. It's an estimate, and in view of the large profits of Swedish banks that are very many billions, not least because they're well run, we think that is a limited cost. There would be, whether you join or not, there would be more need for supervision. So in some ways there will be more of a cost in terms of more supervision as the banks pay for that. That being said, our view is still it's very limited compared to the whole question, and I think what you are effectively asking, will there be less supply of credit to businesses if Sweden were to join the banking union? Well, if the banking union long term works out, there would be hopefully more competition, better competition, which should then benefit Swedish businesses. My personal opinion, although we haven't really looked into that, is that the reason the supply of credit to Swedish small business, not the least, is somewhat limited is the fact that banks want to stay profitable, and there are other things that make them more profitable than lending to small businesses, unfortunately from an economic point of view. So it's really rules, regulations and profitability, not joining the banking union or not, that would be the answer to the supply of credit to small and medium-sized businesses, and to large businesses to an extent as well.
Okay, with one more minute to go, Hans Lindberg.
Well, first, a banking union would, of course, promote a level playing field, and that's a good thing. Then, if you look at the cost, 240 million kronor, that's really peanuts if you compare with the new bank tax, 5 billion 2022, and the bill for Basel IV, which I estimate to being around 10 billion kronor too. So the costs for the banking union, the strict costs, are quite small compared with those two measures.
Okay, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Hans, Lars, Anna-Karin, and Nicolas, for your presentations and for enlightening us in this. Thank you very much.